Because we all know that nobody knew, right? Let's go forward a little bit and talk about something that had already been talked about before. Frankfurter briefly congratulated the president on the passage of the act, but his remarks did not indicate much enthusiasm. In mid April, Brandeis wrote to Frankfurter that Roosevelt seemed to be gaining strength, but he did not mention the appropriation. Brandeis and Frankfurter believed the president did not go far enough, even though the act authorized the greatest single appropriation in the history of the United States or any nation. Although $5 billion was spent during the first year, appropriations tapered off to $6 billion for the next 6 years. This was after saying that the adoption of the act in September of 1934 would be including of a adopting a program of $5 a year for 5 years. So $5 a year for $5 billion for 5 years is $25 billion. Instead, what they got was $11 billion in 7 years. Do the math. Five, 25, 11, and I mean, sorry, yeah, 7, 11, 5, 25, or 7, 11. How are you going to make up the difference? They approved the appropriation with an understanding that what they were doing was valuing things at 5 at 25. But when it came time to actually get to the nitty gritty of what they were going to functionally do, they did a 7-11. Does that have anything to do with something they had done a little earlier, maybe? Brandeis and Frankfurter regarded this fiscal policy with growing disapproval. The first objectionable action was the abrogation in June of the gold clause in public and private contracts. Brandeis asserted that this action was, quote, terrifying in its implications, end quote, because the government had repudiated a, quote, solemn obligation, end quote, because the government, which it had entered into freely. Brandeis concluded that, quote, taxation would have afforded an honorable way out, quote, of a genuine emergency. Yes, Frankfurter replied, quote, what you say of government's own default on obligations is only too true and so needless, end quote. Though Brandeis was, quote, calm about going off gold, end quote, he was disturbed about the government's breach of contract. Roosevelt's decision to buy gold set off a vigorous debate within administration circles, which Brandeis and Frankfurter followed with interest. Atchison recalled that Morgenthau and Herman Oliphant headed a group supporting the policy, while the opposition was led by Oliver Sprague, Lewis Douglas, and James P. Warburg. Corcoran told Frankfurter that Atchison himself was one of the leaders of the opposition. In late August, Brandeis showed Atchison a memorandum written by Harold Stevens, which argued that gold buying was illegal. Within a week, however, Stevens received from Homer Cummings a memorandum by Oliphant supporting the policy. Atchison asked Brandeis for advice, and he recalled that Brandeis's reply, quote, was Delphic, but clear enough to me. I can hear him now saying, Dean, if I wanted a legal opinion, I would prefer to get it from you than from Homer Cummings, end quote. By mid-July, Sprague was unhappy over Roosevelt's policy, but had decided to remain in the Treasury Department, counting on the support of Douglas and Atchison. The conflict intensified. The climatic White House conference to discuss legality was held 19 October. Atchison protested gold buying vigorously, while Cummings fumed at him in impotent fury. Quote, Brandeis wrote to Frankfurter that, quote, things have not bettered since I wrote you last week. The gold purchasing project has augmented the uncertainties. To me, the whole scheme is unintelligible, end quote. Frankfurter replied that Roosevelt had left him with the conviction that his gold purchase policy, quote, was a complete leap in the dark, end quote. He later observed that, quote, FDR seems bent on a policy of monetary stunts, which not one economist here believes in, and very few even pretend to understand, end quote. But while Frankfurter was openly critical in his correspondence with Brandeis, His comments to the president were guarding. In transmitting to Roosevelt a letter from some British economist, Frankfurter remarked that they, quote, have refused to be worshippers of the golden calf theory of currency, end quote. In his most extensive written comment to Roosevelt about gold buying, Frankfurter observed, quote, through the fog of the currency debate is a clear trend of business improvement. As a result of our discussion about gold buying with Will Wooden, I have felt quite clearly that you were giving that policy a tentative trial to see what it could do without committing yourself to that theory any more than to any other theory as a solvent. I don't understand why more people who are sympathetic to your efforts don't understand that. He asserted that after the deflationist and inflationist wings in Congress neutralized each other, Roosevelt could, quote, mobilize general consent, end quote. This letter had been cited as evidence that Frankfurter agreed with Roosevelt's monetary experiments. But this assertion ignores both Frankfurter's way of handling people, particularly Roosevelt, and the letter itself. Frankfurter was trying to influence Roosevelt away from gold buying by stressing the, quote, tentative nature of the policy and by depicting the president as standing in statesmanlike superiority to the monetary tinkerers. Far from approving the policy, Frankfurter criticized it more than Brandeis did. He approved of Sprague's resignation in public statement, not the least for FD's good. He regarded Atchison's resignation with equanimity, but he was disturbed over indications that he had been forced out. In December, Frankfurter reported to Brandeis that Keynes believed gold buying to be puerile, and he later observed that FD is retreating on Warren's theory, and so Sprague's outbursts were all to the good. As late as January 1934, Frankfurter was complaining about Roosevelt's, quote, dollar gyrations, end quote. Roosevelt finally gave up on gold buying later in January. He proposed the stabilization of the dollar, and Congress passed the Gold Reserve Act, which ended the day-by-day fluctuations. It is unlikely that Brandeis and Frankfurter had anything to do with Roosevelt's decision. He abandoned the policy because it did not work. Was it one of those situations where guys like that were bought in for their opinions because they were so fucking important, right?